thank you, Anne, for kicking off this exciting conference. And I really kind of glad to see all of you from all the world. So my name is Jung-Ho Choi. I'm going to moderate the first session. So the paper in the first session is Financial Misconduct and Employee Mistreatment, Evidence from Wage Theft. I believe this paper really fits perfectly the theme of this year's RAST conference, because an important aspect of corporate social responsibility is treat employees fairly, and most of us are employees. We want to be treated fairly. So the presenter is Aneesh Raghunandan from London School of Economics. He will present, as I mentioned, 15 minutes his paper, and then Aiyesha Day from Harvard will discuss the paper for another 15 minutes. Then we will have the Q&A session. So if you have a question during any time the session, you can submit your question through the Google form you can find in this chat function. And Sarah Malik, my coordinator, and also this year's job market candidate from Stanford, will organize those questions and then hand it to them. And during the last 15 minutes, I'm going to also moderate Q&A session based on your question with Aneesh. So overall, we're really excited to start this first session. And without any further ado, Aneesh, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Cool. So thank you, Jung-Ho. And I also wanted to quickly thank Stanford GSB, the RAST editors, and sort of the conference organizers for giving me the chance to present this paper here. And I'm super excited for all of your feedback, and especially for Aiyesha's discussion. And so I've got 15 minutes. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So what do I do? So the big picture question in this paper is going to focus on something called wage theft. Okay, and wage theft refers to, and I'll say more about this later, wage theft refers to basically the act of employers denying employees the rightful pay, compensation, and benefits. And I'll give you some examples of what this is and how it manifests a bit later on. And the big picture question I want to ask is, well, so wage theft is economically meaningful. It's actually the single largest form of theft you can think of any type of theft, like burglary, larceny, whatever you can think of. Wage theft is the single largest form of theft committed in the United States. And the Economic Policy Institute estimates that workers lose anywhere between $8 and $15 billion to their employers basically just not paying. And so what I want to understand is, well, given this kind of meaningful economic action that employers seem to take that has adverse consequences for their employees, the goal of this paper is to try to understand, well, what drives this? And I'm going to think about this kind of from the accounting and finance perspective, which is to say, how do companies' financial incentives interact with employee welfare, right? So I'm going to ask basically two main questions. First, wage theft, as I described it, sounds a bit like it could be a form of real activities or management. So my first kind of big picture question is, well, does wage theft arise from similar kind of corporate and managerial incentives to existing real earnings management measures? And the second question I'm going to ask, right, is basically, okay, so suppose it does. Does it then kind of interact with financial misconduct, right? So wage theft to me is a kind of economically meaningful form of non-financial misconduct. Does it kind of interact with financial misconduct, the way that we often think about real and accrual-based earnings management? So what I'm doing is basically saying, when we talk about real and accrual-based earnings management, we often talk about legal but sketchy actions. Do those findings generalize to outright illegal actions that have adverse consequences for employees? And just to give you a kind of quick preview of what I'm going to find, I've got three main findings. The first is that, well, firms' financial incentives matter, right? And so I'm going to draw upon sort of prior earnings management literature. And my first main finding is that meet or beat incentives seem to matter for wage theft. Firms that just meet or beat analyst forecasts are much more likely to engage in wage theft against their employees. My second main finding is that, okay, so firms' incentives matter. So do managers. I'm going to study a series of circuit court cases, right, that specifically decreased or increased executives' personal liability for wage theft. So this isn't saying, the firm bears liability. This is saying how much responsibility does the CEO, the CFO, upper line managers, how much responsibility do these guys bear for wage theft? And I'm going to show, kind of unsurprisingly, that wage theft increases when executive personal liability decreases and vice versa. And then, okay, so this is kind of the real earnings management side of things. How does this relate to other forms of misconduct? And so I'm going to look at wage theft and financial misconduct. And I'm going to show basically that when wage theft is ongoing but undetected. So I observe the entire period of wage theft. So I know when it starts, I know when it's caught. When wage theft is ongoing but undetected, firms seem less likely to engage in financial misconduct. Once they get caught, though, they seem to switch. So once I get caught stealing from my employees, I stop stealing from them, but instead I start cooking the books. And that's kind of the punchline. So now I'll get a little more into kind of what I do and how I kind of draw these conclusions. So a quick roadmap of the next 11 or 12 minutes. I first want to talk about what wage theft is and how it's enforced. So I need to give some institutional details before I do anything else. Once I've done that, I'm going to talk about how does wage theft relate to firms' financial reporting incentives and managerial incentives. So basically, I'm going to expand on some of the results I just told you about and explain kind of how I got them. And then I'll kind of draw upon, well, what do I do? How do I draw this conclusion that wage theft and financial misconduct are related? And I'll try to wrap up with a kind of big picture, well, why should we care, right? What are the implications of this for making sure that employees get their fair share? Okay, so what is wage theft before we go any further? So a kind of more formal definition of wage theft is that it represents actions taken by firms to deny employees the rightful pay or benefits. And most wage theft violates something called the Fair Labor Standards Act. Some of you might have heard of the Fair Labor Standards Act before, in that it's what regulates minimum wage regulations in the US. But the Fair Labor Standards Act actually oversees and kind of prescribes rules for a bunch of other compensation-related rules as well. And so most wage theft is going to run afoul of the FLSA. And the other thing, and the reason that I think this paper kind of fits in with the theme of the conference, we know a little bit about how financial misconduct and financial misreporting, we kind of know how this interacts with executive compensation, right? We know how this interacts with, for example, employee stock options. There's some work out there on kind of how white collar workers seem to get a wage premium in risky firms. But wage theft actually primarily affects hourly rather than salaried employees. So I'm studying kind of a completely different set of employees, one that's kind of been historically ignored in prior literature, but the one that's also most vulnerable. These are the guys who can't stand up for themselves. And so this is kind of why, what wage theft is and who it affects. And some common examples of this include, for example, forcing employees to underreport hours, right? If I say, if you worked 45 hours and I say you gotta say you only worked 40, I can avoid paying you overtime, right? I might also just misclassify you. So certain workers are exempt from overtime, right? And there are rules governing this, but I might just say, you know what, I'm going to classify you as exempt even though you're not. And the other sort of common form of wage theft that I'm going to, that I see is employees are often forced, are sort of entitled by law to legally mandated paid breaks, right? If I work in retail, for every 5 hours I work, I get a half an hour lunch break, and that's paid. If I force you to work through lunch, then I've stolen some wages from you, right? So these are all kind of ways in which I can exploit my my sort of low skill and low wage workers. And how is this enforced? Wage and hour laws are overseen by the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. And the way this is enforced is actually kind of different from the SEC investigations that we like to think about, right? So WHC relies on frequent investigations, right? 20,000 more than 20,000 per year, but relatively low fines, right? So instead of this SEC process where you have a small number of investigations, but huge fines if you prove guilt, WHC relies kind of on a more outcome-based rather than intent-based enforcement system. And so this is good for me in that it's less likely that any significant wage theft goes undetected in my empirical sample. And then so why do I think this might be attractive as a form of real earnings management? So there are some features of wage theft that are kind of unique relative to other types of real activities management that we've studied, right? Wage theft can be difficult to externally observe, right? If I steal from you, if I'm your employer and I don't pay you your wages, your coworkers probably don't know, right? Whereas if I'm an employer and I pollute, if I pollute, somebody's going to notice that the air quality has gone down, right? So relative to other forms of operational malfeasance, wage theft might be a sort of particularly attractive form of real earnings management. right? It also kind of, unfortunately affects low-wage workers who may be less likely to stand up for themselves, right? Many of us, we read our contracts carefully, we know what's in them, and if the university wrongs us, we're gonna say something, right? But this is less true for a lot of kind of hourly workers who wage theft is really gonna affect, right? And then also because of the, because of some of what I talked about on the last slide, the penalties are capped by law, kind of so that the wage and hour division cannot charge what it deems the actual damages to be, right? So the direct cost of wage theft may be lower than in the case of accrual-based earnings management. Now, on the flip side, most firms, when they get caught, they always argue it's accidental. They didn't know what was going on, right? And so it could be the case that wage theft is just an accident. And if that's the case, I shouldn't find it. All right, so where do I get my data? Most of my data comes from Good Jobs First violation tracker database. And from this, I can identify who committed wage theft and how much they were fined. This provides me with penalty dates, but not start dates. So I also kind of dive directly into the underlying WHD database, a database called Wizard, to identify violation start dates. So I can precisely identify the entire period of wage theft. And then I kind of, I pull financial data from the usual sources. So what do I do empirically? What are my baseline empirical tests? So my first test, I talked about this, does wage theft seem to behave as a form of real earnings management, right? Do companies seem to resort to wage theft when they have financial incentives to make earnings? And so to do so, I'm going to sort of follow prior literature, and I'm going to look at firms that just meet or beat analyst forecasts, right? So I'm going to define a variable called suspect, right? And following prior literature, I'm going to say, we'll call the firms that just meet earnings by between 0 and 2 cents per share. We'll say that they're a little suspicious. And if so, I should observe a relation between these firms and the likelihood of wage theft. And I measure wage theft in 4 different ways, right? Both to measure the incidence and the severity. So I use, as my dependent variables, I've got an indicator. I use the log of the sort of total penalty amount. Now, of course, the total penalty amount could be just correlated with the firm size or the number of employees. So I also look at sort of the per affected employee penalty amount. So I observe exactly how many employees were affected by each kind of incidence of wage theft. So I look at per capita penalties instead of outright penalties. And I also look at kind of the number of distinct sites at which wage theft occurred to understand how widespread within a firm is wage theft. And so I find basically, I know I've only got about 4 or 5 minutes, I find that firms with meet or beat incentives are more likely to engage in wage theft relative to firms that don't have meet or beat incentives. And this finding is robust to kind of alternate sample definitions, other alternate definitions of wage theft that I didn't show. But basically, when I'm under pressure to meet earnings, one way in which I seem to do that is by just robbing my employees, right? That's kind of the punchline. So then, okay, that's firm level incentives. What about individual managerial incentives? And I was interested in this because one argument that's commonly made in favor, that justifies managers preferring real earnings management to accrual-based earnings management is that if I'm the CFO and I get caught engaging in financial manipulation, I can get sued, right? But a classical argument goes that I can't really get sued for real earnings management because real earnings management is typically conflated with competitive strategy, right? So it's going to be really hard to sue me and win if I'm a CEO and I cut advertising or SG&A, right? It's really hard to prove that just cutting SG&A is myopic and value destructive as opposed to just part of a longer term strategy. What's cool about the wage theft setting is that wage theft is illegal, right? So it's less, it's not going to hold up in court as well if I say, you know what, I was just robbing my employees, but it's just competitive strategy. You should let me off. And I can actually kind of identify this because I observe a series of court cases. And these are US circuit court cases that either increase or decrease personal liability for executives that are deemed to have quote unquote significant control of employees in that circuit, right? So basically I observe staggered variation across geography and time, right? So I can estimate a diff and diff of the effect of these court cases, right? To test whether individual litigation risk actually matters. And this is something that kind of sets the wage theft setting apart from many other real earnings management settings that we like to talk about, right? So basically, I'm going to estimate 2 different things. right? What happens when a court case suddenly drives up liability? What happens when a court case suddenly drives down liability for wage theft? And as you might expect, if I'm a CEO and after a court case that says I can be held more liable for wage theft, I become less likely, or my firm becomes less likely to engage. Okay. And there's one more main result I want to get to, which is that this seems to establish that wage theft behaves a lot like other forms of real activities management, but potentially much more harmful for employees, right? And given that wage theft seems to behave like real earnings management, does it interact with firms' financial reporting or misreporting incentives in the way that we often think about real and accrual-based earnings management? And so I'm going to kind of look at how wage theft interacts with AEERs and securities lawsuits, right? And I basically have, the punchline is basically that I find evidence of a substitute relation, right? I find that financial misconduct, right? So the firm years that are ultimately result in an AEER or a shareholder lawsuit for securities misrepresentation, I find that financial misconduct is less common when wage theft is undetected. But after wage theft gets caught, we see a bit of a flip where I suddenly start to cook the books more because I'm now less likely in the future to keep on robbing my employees, right? I'm less like, so after I get caught, I'm less likely to engage in future wage theft, right? Conditional on before, but also more likely to start getting in to start manipulating financials. Okay, so just to wrap up, I know I'm almost out of time. What do I do, big picture? I study how corporate wage theft interacts with firms' financial reporting incentives. And using a variety of empirical tests and settings, I'm going to find basically three main things, right? Wage theft is driven by both firm level and individual managerial financial incentives. And I've also kind of identified a real earnings management setting that actually does involve non-trivial individual litigation risk, right? In many cases, when we talk about real earnings management, it's hard to identify some of the costs because we don't have things like litigation and reputation costs that we can easily identify. In this setting, I actually do. And I also kind of find that there's a substitute relation between wage theft and financial misconduct. Big picture, what does this all mean? What are the implications? So one common argument that firms make is that wage theft is simply accidental. I didn't mean to do it. I'm sorry. I won't do it again, right? But if that was the case, I shouldn't see such a strong relation with their financial reporting incentives. And so my findings suggest that wage theft may not just be accidental. It may be sort of reflective of a strategy in which firms try to make earnings or try to make financial targets by cutting wages and having employees suffer. And there's kind of a big picture policy implication here as well, which is that I read through some policy documents. So the Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, other DOL divisions, they talk about various trigger events, right? And certain risk factors that may trigger inspections. In all of the policy documents I read, I didn't find a single mention of financial incentives. And so maybe if we want to improve labor enforcement in the future, maybe if we want to protect workers more efficiently, we should start considering firms' financial incentives. And I think I'm out of time. So once again, thank you all for listening in. I look forward to questions, and I'm looking forward to Aiyesha's discussion.
All right. So first of all, I want to say hello to everyone. It's really nice to see so many of my friends and colleagues, because it's been a while since I've been at a conference. And of course, thank you so much to the conference organizers for letting me have this opportunity to be here and to discuss this paper. And thank you, Aneesh. That was a fantastic paper, and you presented it so well. It's really very polished, so I hope my comments can be useful in some form to you. So let me quickly have a brief summary of the paper as I understood it. Here are the questions and the main findings. So I felt that the key question the paper was trying to get at is wage theft a form of real earnings management? So specifically to get at this, Aneesh asks a couple of questions. First, does wage theft arise from similar financial incentives that motivate earnings management? And second, does wage theft complement or substitute other forms of earnings management and or of financial misconduct? Some of the main conclusions were: one, firms engage in wage theft more frequently in years when they just meet or beat analyst forecasts, and firms whose CEOs have greater risk-related financial incentives and or lower personal litigation risk are more likely to engage in wage theft. and it is a substitute to other forms of financial misconduct. So a key inference that we can get out of all of these very interesting tests is that wage theft is an economically meaningful form of earnings management. So just to summarize, I think the paper has many strengths. It examines an important, currently relevant, and relatively understudied question. The analyses are very careful, and I think it provokes interesting avenues of future research, which is a hallmark of a good paper. So I think this paper definitely qualifies there. I want to present some opportunities that I think that the paper has to further tighten its story. And really what I want to focus on is understanding with a little more rigor what the mechanism is that is at play here. For example, whether and how this fits in the real earnings management literature, and what other forces such as corporate culture, tone at the top, and secondly, monitoring by headquarters, could these be driving the results that we find here as well? And I also want to talk a little bit about some interesting existing culture tests that the paper also did, but Aneesh didn't get a chance to share in the presentation. And then if I do have time, I want to go into some other comments and suggestions related to data, as well as some ideas for cross-sectional tests for Aneesh's consideration. So let me start with the point of the mechanism. So I feel like the heart of the inferences, I think, lie on the theory of what is this earnings management construct. So I thought I would set the stage by laying out, as I understand it, given the literature of what exactly is earnings management. So we have three categories: as real earnings management, accrual earnings management, and fraudulent accounting. So real earnings management, based on the literature, is really managers' attempt to overstate earnings by altering underlying real transactions in a way that is often detrimental to long-term value. So one of the key issues here is that it is legal in the sense that managers have this business judgment principle, which allows them some form of legal cover, because they can say that, you know, this was the best judgment that they took, even if it ends up with negative consequences in the long run. So even though this is something auditors can frown upon, they can't really go and say that you did something illegal. So that is what I understand what real earnings management is. Accruals earning management is also legal in the sense it is within GAAP, but managers can use such choices to obscure or mask true economic performance. And then, of course, we have fraudulent accounting, where you just violate GAAP, and which is clearly illegal. Typically, these are made by the C-suite, CEO and or CFO at the headquarters level, and the goal is to meet earnings targets, influence earnings, EPS numbers. So with that backdrop, I thought I'll kind of revisit the issue we are studying here, which is corporate wage theft. So as Aneesh explained, you know, this is a type of corporate misconduct. It encompasses really expropriation of employees in a way. So you can not pay them for overtime. You can force them to underreport the number of hours worked. And it typically focuses on your lower paid rank and file employees. So the first thing that I thought reading this is clearly illegal. This is stealing from employees. So a business judgment cover would probably not apply here if this was caught, right? So, you know, contrasting it with a related paper, the Kasky and Ozel 2017, where they look at underinvesting in workplace safety as a form of earnings management, that somehow makes a little more sense to me as earnings management, because you can always say, I didn't want to invest in maintenance for this year because that was the best judgment at that point in time. We thought our maintenance workplace safety items were in good order, so we didn't want to further invest. So that rings to me a little more like real earnings management versus something as illegal as wage theft. So that's one issue. The second is this often takes place at the facilities level, right? Outside of headquarters. So the question that I thought of when I read this is that, so who is really making the decision? It's the CEO, CFO calling up the facilities to tell them to engage in this, or is this a facility level decision? So really to summarize, the first issue I would love for Aneesh to think about a little more is this real earnings management or just a way of corporate fraud? And I think it's important because it's not just a labeling issue. It's important because it influences subsequent research questions, analyses, tests. For example, inferences regarding the substitution between real and accrual earnings management, right? And secondly, it also affects how do you position this research in its appropriate place in the literature. So I think thinking a little deeper about what is the construct we're looking at could be important. Secondly, a key assumption here is that the C-suite is directly engaging in wage theft. And so that's the thing I wanted to focus on next on is could there be other forces that could be a driving mechanism in this case? So the first one I want to think about is the tone at the top. So top executives through the tone at the top can create a culture where the lower level employees feel substantial pressure to meet various performance goals. And this can create a culture of corruption where really individuals across all levels in the organization are potentially manipulating numbers, right? So so middle management may be driven to boost their division numbers by any means that is available to them. So that includes wage theft. But of course, such pressures are likely to be higher when top executives feel more financial incentive pressures or lower personal risk. So they kind of drive that pressure down to all the executives managers below them. So I took a quick look at the data, and of course, Aneesh, you know the data way better than me, so please, I apologize if I got this incorrectly, but I wanted to see do we see a pervasive culture of manipulation, corruption in the firms that are more likely to have wage theft? So this is from the same the website, the Good Jobs First, that Aneesh used, and I looked at the top 10 companies with wage theft, and you see a lot of them like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America, they have, as we know, other misconduct. So if I double click on JP Morgan, for example, really you can see a multiple other offenses. So there seems to be a culture of corruption. So to me, it seemed like the culture angle can't be ruled out as easily as what could be driving this. So in some, who is making these decisions? Of course, while the top management may not directly be engaging in wage theft, they are certainly culpable because they create a culture by which the pressure goes down to the lower level facility managers who are engaging in these kinds of activities. But still, even having said that, it's slightly different than saying that they use wage theft as a tool for real earnings management. So the second mechanism I want to focus on is poor monitoring by headquarters. So if the headquarter monitoring is weak, regardless of culture, of course, this is worse when the culture is bad, but regardless of culture, middle management could potentially expropriate rank and file employees. So, and this is worse because when violation firms are very large and are geographically dispersed, so then the headquarters may be further removed from facility level decision making. So in that context, I would love to point your attention, Aneesh, to a paper with a couple of my colleagues at HBS, Jonas Sees and Gerardo Perez Cavazos in 2020, who did, which is similar to this topic. So they examined the effects of headquarter manager visits on facilities misconduct. So they find a clever research design as well. They look at staggered introduction of airline routes to identify exogenous travel time reductions between the headquarters and the facility, and they use that to proxy for when there's a reduction in travel time, managers are more likely to visit the facilities from headquarters. And they see, does this affect facility level misconduct? So they find on average, travel time reductions lead to a decrease in facility misconduct, including wage theft, both in terms of the number of violations and penalties. So it seems like headquarters managers they try to minimize the more severe violations in addition to the number of violations. But they also find that when there's high performance pressure in high performance pressure years, wage theft is more likely in facilities closer to the headquarters, as in that case, top management can more effectively push down the performance pressure to those facilities. So I think given the similarity of the topics, it would be nice if you can link your study to theirs. And I think it actually would help your results if you could do some analyses along these lines and further confirm, what is the mechanism or what's going on. So I think this would be a nice study for you to consider. So the next thing I want to focus on is some of the tests of corporate culture that Aneesh does, I think with a view to trying to rule out the culture channel. So a couple of comments on this. The first is the measurement. Of course, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to try and measure something like culture, right? And so what Aneesh does is he looks at two proxies. One is the internal control weaknesses and also compliance history of the firm. I know prior work has used this, but these to me seem more like outcomes of a culture as well. And it's easy for me to say, but if you can use a more direct measure of culture basically where we are looking at the issue that we're talking about, the cultural problem, that is, there is high performance pressure, employees are being mistreated by managers, etc. And so one suggestion, of course, I don't, I think a lot of papers have used this, is you can use Glassdoor employee ratings on the employee treatment. They talk about how their direct supervisor, the facility manager, is treating them, the culture in the firm, etc. And I think the interesting thing here is this is available at the facility level. So I feel maybe that could, help link the facility level wage theft to this more easily. The other thing I want to quickly mention about this is that the author argues that substitution of financial misconduct for wage theft after it's caught will be stronger for firms with weak cultures, and then fails to find this outcome, and so rules out culture. And so just a couple of points on that is, to me, it wasn't clear that if you fail to find a significant cross-sectional factor in a substitution and test, that rules out the fact that culture was not an important factor in the original outcome. So I would want to rethink how we can test this, to make sure that the culture is not one of the channels here. And the second thing is, assuming that SEC is not aware of wage theft. So just having been there for a year, I know a little bit about how they look at some things. So, they do have this TCR, or the tips, complaints, and referrals channel. So they may not have referrals, but they still have tips and complaints from employees by which they can be aware of this. And they also look at private litigations. In fact, they have this RoboCop thing they call a model that they use to predict what are the firms with higher red flag, where should we investigate, where should we go next, and where litigations are a factor in that model. So again, I would maybe think, test a little deeper, or think a little deeper about if we can rule out the fact that the SEC is not aware of this, and so the future investigations are not predicated by the knowledge of the wage theft. And in fact, the notion of private litigation, as I just again looked at one company from the database, and you can see UPS, the significant private litigation that follows the wage theft. So it seems, another point, it seems pretty costly. So when you say that it could be a low cost form of management, I would think twice, because these, even though the firms are big, 87 million, these are big numbers. So I would, I wonder how, if it is low cost at all. So very quickly, I think I have a couple of minutes left, so I'll quickly go through some of the other comments and suggestions. So one thing I wanted to push a little bit more is to make sure that the inspections are truly random. So we have, the good jobs first is the primary data set, and the underlying data set that Aneesh uses is the DOL's wage and hour division. So for example, as I said, the SEC looks for red flags, employee tips, other organizations. So the WHD could be doing the same. They can surely get tips from facility workers. So I mean, I wonder to what extent this is truly random. But one suggestion is that, if you can get information on all inspections, so it seems like the DOL appears to report all inspections regardless of penalties, et cetera. So I tried to compare the two data sets, and again, this is my knowledge of this is much less than yours, but what it seemed to me is that the Department of Labor puts out all inspections regardless of whether there were penalties, violations, or not, whereas the good jobs first only reports the ones with penalties. So one option is you could try to model the probability of receiving an inspection based on another red flag, such as an OSHA violation, et cetera, and you don't want those to load on the probability of an inspection. So again, this is just a check to make sure that their decision is not really being driven by other indiscretions. Very quickly, a few cross-sectional test suggestions, by firm operations, by industry, geographical dispersion, proximity to headquarters. This could, again, link to the mechanism if you choose to explore those. Executive incentives, I thought the test on the personal litigation risk was very clever, but another suggestion is to really look at the bonuses, because I think those are more directly related to meeting earnings numbers, and they're a larger part really of executive compensation versus options. Finally, a reputation effect, given how costly the private litigation is, could executives with more severe reputational consequences have a incentive to have tighter controls on facility misconduct, et cetera. So that's just another So let me quickly wrap up by summarizing really the big picture. What do we learn from this? I think the paper's results are interesting for at least 3 reasons. One is it contributes to the literature on stakeholder relations. So this is a literature gaining momentum, and employees are a very primary form of stakeholders. And so what we learned from this paper is, what are the properties of firms that engage in employee expropriation? Second, it contributes to the literature on corporate misconduct. So it tells standard setters and other monitors that here is another pervasive and economically meaningful form of manipulation. And it also motivates ideas for governance systems and future research. So it stimulates discussions on what type of mechanisms are needed to protect employees and other stakeholders, and also opens the path for future work on corporate labor market consequences of wage theft. For example, what hiring frictions do these firms face? So overall, I think it looks at an important question. The results are very significant. And the only really my comments or just suggestions were, how could you further tighten the story? And one is, expand the analysis on the mechanisms at play and really understand what is the construct you're getting at and how to better position it in the literature accordingly. So compare and contrast with some of the papers that are closely related on this topic. And I really learned a lot from this paper. So thank you again, Aneesh, for writing it. So thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Aiyesha, and thank you everyone to listen to the presentation. Now we move on to the Q&A session. So 2 things I want to mention. One is that we have now about like 9 minutes. So every question that audience asks will be delivered to Aneesh. So don't worry, your question will be appreciated by the Aneesh, but because of sake of time, we'll actually cover as many questions as we can within this time. And also, some of you mentioned in the comment, thank you, like a great paper. I probably take out that part because I said it one time, and then I cannot actually say every time actually great question and a great paper, and then like go on the question. And also like Aiyesha already kind of put, touched on many of the important points. So, and Aneesh, you can also use this time to kind of answer at the same time. So the first question, by the way, many people ask the question, but the first person, I just like to mention one person like who asked probably the first, Srita Basu from Temple University, and I just like a layout. He exactly asked like, isn't wage theft considerably worse than real earnings management because it is illegal as opposed to just overproduction to drive down cost of goods sold? Then is real earnings management the first order consequence, or is it more a cash flow or liquidity issue? So overall, there are other questions. Try to understand how it is different from real earnings management, and also just if I add one more based on some other questions, how then actually companies try to use different instruments of this real earnings management, wage theft or other real earnings management combined together. What's the incentive to use one versus the other?
Okay, cool. So I'll try to answer that in a couple of parts. The first part, basically, as I understand it, is, well, so number one, yes, I do think wage theft is substantially more severe than other forms of real earnings management that we see, right? So to me, wage theft is, you can almost think of it as, at least the way I think of it, is real earnings management gone way too far, right? So to kind of come back to the point, I do think that I think it arises from similar incentives to real earnings management. And what I mean is like, a company might not start out by saying, let's actively engage in wage theft, but you might say, well, our wage bill is too high. What can we do to bring it down? What can we do to bring it down? Let's cut our wages a little bit. It's hard to observe these things, right? So to kind of come back to a point Aiyesha made and a paper Aiyesha cited, this Caskey and Erzl paper that looks at injuries, right? So injuries don't necessarily reflect wrongdoing. But I don't really have the sort of analog in my setting, right? So it's harder for me to sort of figure out exactly where firms fall down that slippery slope. But I do think that, so, firms don't just set out one fine day necessarily saying, let's rob our workers. It starts with, let's cut wages. Let's see, where can we find a dime? And then it starts to get into, well, maybe we just say that you're exempt from overtime when you're not, right? So kind of, I unfortunately can't observe a lot of the process that firms take to get to that point, but I can see when firms are at that point. So to me, it kind of arises from a lot of similar, a lot of the same incentives that real earnings management arises from. But I do think it's obviously much more severe, and kind of comparing it to other proxies for earnings management, right? Like in a lot of cases when we see things like, a low discretionary SG&A, right? It's not necessarily clear who's being harmed by that. Like it's someone's being harmed. We don't necessarily know who. One thing that I kind of like about the setting is that it's very clear who the stakeholders are, right, that are being harmed, right? And to me, it's kind of, and so it's easier to tell a story around firms have financial incentives, there are consequences, and look who's affected. And sorry, there was a second part of that question, Jung Ho, and now I'm kind of blanking on that. I don't know if.
Yeah. So I mean, given that, maybe I also move a little bit further, combining with some of the questions also of Rachel. Could you tell the specific question is what are other motives for wage theft? And then some other people also ask, given that you mentioned there are multiple instruments that companies have to do this earnings management, how do you view what motivation really kind of incentivize them to engage in wage theft and others? And then he actually mentioned a few more detailed supervisor concerns with the reporting of hourly work and how that may affect his or her evaluation, promotion, bonus. And these violations seem to be more about internal operational issues and incentive than external reporting ones.
Okay, yeah. So I'll try to take that piece by piece. So the part about why might firms do this, right? And I think that was kind of the first thing you asked.
Right.
Well, so one reason is that, and I don't know if I did a great job sort of covering this in my presentation, right? Well, one reason that it's hard to detect, right, by third parties. So if we think about other forms of operational misconduct, right? If you think about, I can decide to just not comply with toxic waste regulations. I can decide to cut investments in worker safety, right? If we're all workers in a factory, and I can see when maintenance hasn't been done, right? But if somebody is underpaying you, I don't necessarily see that, right? So the sort of direct costs are lower. And then this actually then leads into kind of, I want to sort of touch on one of Aiyesha's points about litigation risk, right? In that, yes, there is litigation risk, right? But it's actually lower than it's substantially lower than it could be. The reason being that many companies force their employees into confidential mandatory arbitration, right? So we have a setting in which I unfortunately can't identify which companies have arbitration clauses, which don't. That data is private. It's a pain to get. I tried, I failed. But we have a setting in which many firms, and I unfortunately can't precisely identify which ones, many firms actually have no firm level litigation risk, right? And minimal reputational risk. Because if, you might rob me, but then the worst I can do is take you to arbitration, you pay me a settlement, I go away, and nobody finds out about it. Right, and so this is a setting where there's no firm level litigation risk, right? And this doesn't quite touch on individual litigation risk, but litigation risk is certainly lower than in the case of many other forms of misconduct.
So then another question, a sake of time, actually, if we move a little bit a different angle, also Aiyesha mentioned cross-sectional variation. So one of the questions many people have asked, one dimension, John Barrios from Washington University, how prominent is wage theft in public firms versus private firms? Your variation is within publicly traded firms. This would be nice to consider to help understand whether your documented relation is a lower or upper bound. And also other cross-sectional variation. Moment.
Yeah, so let me take that one first, actually, and then we can, yeah. So, yeah, so, okay, so the vast majority of, or the majority of the Good Jobs First data, right, and the majority of documented cases of wage theft that I see are in private firms, right? And it is also the case that for many private firms, right, a $10,000 penalty for UPS doesn't mean much. A $10,000 penalty for a little mom and pop shop can put them out of business. Right, and so the penalties are sort of so this kind of works differently and is enforced differently in private firms. The problem with, I guess, I hesitate to say whether it's more pervasive in private firms. The reason being that I don't really know the denominator, right? I can sort of look at the number of firms that have been caught, but I feel there's another issue. There's another issue here, which is also target selection. Right, so my sample consists of relatively large publicly traded firms, right? And so in general, on the margin, there may be some differences. There may be a size effect in who gets targeted. But in general, I'd say among the set of large public firms, right, size isn't likely to be too much of a factor in who gets targeted, right, for inspection. But I do know that the Department of Labor, at least starting in the mid-2000s, started to focus more on large firms relative to smaller firms. The idea being that we want to catch the biggest fish. You can find some speeches out there by David Weil, who ran the WHD, kind of talking about how they kind of move towards this setting, right? And so my suspicion is that there's a lot more undetected wage theft, or at least as in as much as we want to rely on WHD data, right? My suspicion is that there's much more undetected wage theft among small firms, right? And so I hesitate to I know it's a bit of a cop-out, I hesitate to give kind of a straight answer, and I'm sorry for that, John.
It's actually great. I guess now it's time, but first of all, before I'm kind of ending, there are so many actually interesting questions right now in the Excel file, and thank you very much to the audience gave all these questions. It will be, as I mentioned, handed to Aneesh, and also thank you, Aiyesha, discussing this very well, this paper. And so this is the end of the first session, and then we will gradually move to the other sessions, and then I hope that you also enjoy all the remaining sessions. Thank you.